The final approach to the ranch tested every ounce of strength that Sarah had left. Despite having water and feeling renewed hope, her body was severely weakened by nearly 2 weeks of extreme conditions. Each step toward the buildings in the distance required tremendous effort, and she found herself stopping frequently to rest and gather. Sarah spent 3 days at the abandoned mining site, using the time to recover her strength and prepare for the next phase of her journey. The respite gave her body time to recover from the severe dehydration she had experienced, and the additional supplies she had found significantly improved her chances of survival. However, she knew that staying at the site indefinitely was not an option. The water she had discovered was limited, and there was no guarantee that rescue teams would ever find this remote location. During her time at the mining site, Sarah made several important discoveries that would prove crucial to her continued survival. While exploring the area around the abandoned buildings, she found evidence of an old access road that had once connected the mining operation to larger transportation routes. Although the road was now barely visible and badly eroded, it provided her with a clear direction to follow when she resumed her journey. More importantly, Sarah discovered that the mining site was located near what appeared to be a seasonal water source. A dry creek bed ran past the abandoned buildings, and while it contained no water during her visit, the vegetation along its banks suggested that water flowed there during certain times of the year. This discovery gave Sarah an idea that would ultimately save her life. Sarah reasoned that if water occasionally flowed through this area, it must come from somewhere and go somewhere. By following the creek bed, she might be able to find a more permanent water source, such as a spring or a place where the underground water table was closer to the surface. Even if she found no water, the creek bed would provide her with a natural pathway that was easier to follow than the uncertain desert terrain. On her 7th day alone in the desert, Sarah made the decision to leave the mining site and follow the dry creek bed westward. She had crafted a more efficient water collection system using the metal containers she had found, and she had fashioned better protection from the sun using the salvage tarp. Most importantly, she had learned to pace herself and conserve energy during the hottest parts of the day. The creek bed proved to be both a blessing and a curse. On the positive side, it provided relatively easy walking and a clear direction to follow. The banks offered occasional shade from overhanging rocks and sparse vegetation. However, the bed was also a natural funnel for desert winds, which sometimes created sandstorms that forced Sarah to seek shelter and wait for conditions to improve. Following the creek bed for 2 days, Sarah made a discovery that filled her with hope and terror in equal measure. She found the remains of a small aircraft that had crashed in the desert years earlier. The wreckage was weathered and partially buried in sand, but it was clearly the remains of a light aircraft that had gone down in this remote area. Sarah's initial excitement at finding evidence of human activity was quickly tempered by the realization that this represented someone else's failed attempt to traverse the desert. The crash site was remote and had clearly been undiscovered for years, which suggested that this area was even more isolated than she had feared. However, she decided to search the wreckage for anything that might be useful for her survival. The search of the aircraft wreckage proved to be another turning point in Sarah's ordeal. Among the debris, she found a partially intact emergency kit that contained several items crucial for survival. Most importantly, she discovered a working emergency locator beacon that had somehow remained functional despite years of exposure to the desert environment. The emergency beacon was a small, battery-powered device designed to transmit a distress signal that could be detected by search and rescue aircraft. Sarah was amazed to find that it still had power and appeared to be operational. She activated the device immediately, sending out a signal that she hoped would be detected by rescue services. In addition to the beacon, Sarah found other useful items in the aircraft wreckage. There were additional water purification tablets, a small first aid kit, and some emergency food rations that were still edible. She also found a more detailed map of the region that helped her better understand her location and the surrounding terrain. The map revealed that Sarah was much further from civilization than she had estimated. She was in one of the most remote parts of the Mojave Desert, more than 50 miles from the nearest paved road. However, the map also showed her something encouraging. There was a small town called Desert Springs approximately 30 miles to the southwest of her estimated position. Desert Springs was described on the map as a historic mining town with a permanent population. If Sarah could reach this town, she would find safety and rescue. The distance was daunting, especially considering her weakened condition, but it represented her best chance for survival. The alternative was to remain at the crash site and hope that the emergency beacon would attract rescue aircraft. But there was no guarantee that anyone was monitoring the frequency or that aircraft regularly flew over this area. Sarah made the difficult decision to continue her journey toward Desert Springs while keeping the emergency beacon activated. She would travel during the cooler parts of the day and rest during the heat, following the creek bed as long as it continued in the right direction. If the beacon attracted rescue aircraft, she would be ready to signal them. If not, she would have the town as a backup destination. The next phase of Sarah's journey tested her physical and mental limits in ways she had never imagined. The desert seemed to become more hostile with each passing day. The temperature during midday now regularly exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rocky terrain made walking treacherous and exhausting. Sarah's feet were badly blistered despite her hiking boots, and every step caused pain that shot up through her legs. Water remained her most critical concern. Despite her improved collection methods, she was able to gather only small amounts each night. Her body was consuming water faster than she could replace it, and she knew that she was slowly losing the battle against dehydration. Her urine had become dark and scanty, her mouth was constantly dry, and she experienced frequent dizzy spells that forced her to stop and rest. On her 10th day alone, Sarah experienced what she would later describe as the lowest point of her entire ordeal. The creek bed had led her into a box canyon with steep walls that she could not climb. She was forced to backtrack several miles to find an alternative route, losing precious time and energy in the process. By the time she found a way around the obstacle, she was severely exhausted and had consumed most of her remaining water. That evening, Sarah collapsed in the shade of a large boulder and seriously considered giving up. Every part of her body ached, and the constant heat and dehydration had left her feeling weak and disoriented. She had been walking for days without seeing any signs of human habitation, and Desert Springs still seemed impossibly far away. The emergency beacon had been transmitting for several days without any sign that it had been detected. However, as Sarah sat in despair, she remembered something that gave her the strength to continue. Before leaving for the desert, she had promised her younger sister that she would return safely from her adventure. Her sister had worried about the dangerous nature of Sarah's travels and had made Sarah promise to be careful and come home. The thought of breaking that promise, of leaving her sister to wonder what had happened to her, gave Sarah the motivation she needed to keep fighting. That night, as Sarah lay under the desert stars, she made a vow to herself. She would not give up, no matter how hopeless her situation seemed. She would continue walking toward Desert Springs, and she would survive to tell the story of what had happened to her in the desert. This mental commitment proved to be crucial, as it sustained her through the most difficult challenges that still lay ahead. The 11th day brought new trials and an unexpected discovery. As Sarah followed a dry wash that she hoped would lead her closer to Desert Springs, she encountered a flash flood warning situation. Although there had been no rain in her immediate area, storm clouds were visible in the distant mountains, and she could hear the rumble of thunder echoing across the desert. Sarah's survival training had taught her about the dangers of flash floods in desert environments. Rain falling in distant mountains could create sudden, violent floods that rushed down through dry creek beds with little warning. Being caught in such a flood could be fatal, as the water moved with tremendous force and carried dangerous debris. Recognizing the danger, Sarah climbed to higher ground and waited for the storm to pass. As she sheltered among the rocks, she witnessed one of the most spectacular and terrifying displays of nature's power she had ever seen. The distant storm unleashed torrential rain on the mountains, and within hours, a wall of muddy water came rushing down the creek bed where she had been walking just hours earlier. The flood was both destructive and beneficial for Sarah's survival situation. On the negative side, it destroyed the path she had been following and created new obstacles that she would need to navigate. However, the flood also left behind pools of water trapped in rock formations along its path. For the first time in days, Sarah had access to a substantial amount of fresh water. Sarah spent the next day carefully collecting and purifying the flood water using the tablets she had found in the aircraft wreckage. She was able to refill all of her containers and, for the first time since leaving the mining site, drink as much water as her body needed. The relief was immediate and dramatic. Her energy returned, her thinking became clearer, and her spirits lifted considerably. The flood had also revealed something that would prove crucial to Sarah's eventual rescue. As the water receded, it exposed a section of old asphalt road that had been buried under years of accumulated sand and debris. The road was badly deteriorated and clearly unused, but it represented a direct connection to the outside world. Following this abandoned road, Sarah made better progress than she had in days. Although the asphalt surface was cracked and partially covered with sand, it was easier to walk on than the rocky desert terrain. More importantly, roads led somewhere, and Sarah was confident that this one would eventually connect to more significant transportation routes. On her 13th day alone in the desert, Sarah spotted something in the distance that made her heart race with excitement. Smoke was rising from a location several miles ahead of her, suggesting the presence of human activity. After nearly 2 weeks of seeing nothing but empty desert, this sign of civilization seemed almost too good to be true. As Sarah approached the source of the smoke, she discovered a small ranch complex nestled in a valley between low hills. The buildings appeared to be inhabited, with vehicles visible in the yard, and clear signs of ongoing activity. After 13 days of isolation and struggle, Sarah had finally found people who could help her. However, her ordeal was not quite over. The ranch was still several miles away, and Sarah's physical condition had deteriorated significantly during her desert journey. She was severely weakened by dehydration and exhaustion, and the final approach to the ranch would require her last reserves of strength and determination. As the sun began to set on her 13th day alone in the Mojave Desert, Sarah Mitchell prepared for what she hoped would be the final push of her incredible survival journey. The ranch buildings ahead represented safety, rescue, and an end to the ordeal that had tested every limit of human endurance. What she did not yet know was that her story of survival would inspire countless others and change the way experts thought about human resilience in extreme environments. The second morning without Marcus brought a crushing realization that Sarah had been trying to avoid. As she sat in the meager shade of the rock formation, watching the sun rise over the endless expanse of desert, she finally accepted the truth that her mind had been refusing to process. Marcus was not coming back. Whether by accident or design, she was truly alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Sarah's first instinct was panic. Her heart raced as she considered the full scope of her situation. She was at least 2 days' hike from where they had left the truck, assuming she could even find her way back. Her water supply consisted of 1 full bottle and 1 that was half empty. She had some energy bars and trail mix, but no substantial food. Most critically, she had no means of communication and no way to signal for help. Fighting against the rising terror, Sarah forced herself to think logically. She was an experienced hiker and had read extensively about survival techniques. The first rule of desert survival, she remembered, was to conserve water and avoid unnecessary exertion during the hottest parts of the day. She needed to create a plan and stick to it, no matter how desperate her situation seemed. Sarah decided to spend the day at her current location, conserving energy and water while she figured out her next steps. She used her camera equipment bag and some clothes to create better shade, fashioning a small shelter against the rocks. The temperature was already climbing rapidly, and she knew that moving during the heat of the day would be suicide. As she sat in her improvised shelter, Sarah tried to reconstruct their journey and estimate her location. She remembered the general direction they had traveled from Las Vegas and tried to calculate how far they had come. Based on their driving time and hiking distance, she estimated that she was somewhere in the central Mojave Desert, possibly near the California-Nevada border. This knowledge was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it gave her a general sense of direction, but terrifying because she realized just how vast and empty this region was. During the long, hot hours of that day, Sarah made several critical decisions that would ultimately save her life. First, she decided that attempting to retrace their route back to the truck would be too risky. She wasn't confident about the exact path they had taken, and the desert terrain all looked remarkably similar. Getting lost while trying to find the truck could be fatal. Instead, Sarah decided to head west, toward the general direction of major highways and populated areas. She knew that Interstate 15, which connected Las Vegas to Los Angeles, ran somewhere to the west of her position. If she could maintain a westerly direction and cover enough ground, she would eventually encounter signs of civilization. Sarah spent hours planning her survival strategy. She would travel during the early morning and late afternoon when temperatures were more bearable. During the hottest part of the day, she would seek shade and rest. She rationed her water strictly, allowing herself small sips at regular intervals rather than drinking when she felt thirsty. That first night alone was terrifying. Every sound in the darkness seemed magnified and threatening. Sarah heard coyotes calling in the distance, and at one point, something large rustled through the rocks nearby. She barely slept, jumping at every noise and wondering what dangers might be lurking in the desert shadows. The next morning, Sarah began her trek westward. She had fashioned a head covering from a spare shirt to protect herself from the sun and filled her pockets with rocks to use as markers. Her plan was to mark her trail as she went, creating a path she could follow back if necessary. The first few hours of hiking were relatively manageable. The morning air was cool, and Sarah felt strong and determined. She made good progress across the rocky terrain, using her compass app on her phone to maintain a westerly direction. Although her phone had no signal, the compass function still worked, and she was grateful for this small technological advantage. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature began to soar, Sarah sought shelter under a large boulder. The heat was becoming unbearable, and she could feel it sapping her strength and depleting her body's water reserves. She forced herself to rest, even though every instinct screamed at her to keep moving and find help as quickly as possible. During this rest period, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. In the distance, she could see what appeared to be a dirt road or trail cutting across the desert floor. It was several miles away, but it represented the first sign of human activity she had seen since Marcus disappeared. She decided to alter her course to intersect with this road, hoping it might lead to a ranch, mining operation, or other form of civilization. The journey to reach the road took most of the afternoon. The terrain was more challenging than it had appeared from a distance, with deep ravines and rocky outcrops that forced Sarah to take lengthy detours. By the time she reached the road, she was exhausted and had consumed most of her remaining water. The road was indeed man-made, with tire tracks visible in the sandy surface. However, it was clearly not a major thoroughfare. The tracks appeared old and weathered, suggesting that vehicles passed this way infrequently. Still, it represented a connection to the outside world, and Sarah decided to follow it westward, hoping it would lead to a more significant route or destination. Walking along the road was easier than traversing the open desert, but it came with its own challenges. The exposed surface offered no shade, and the heat radiating from the ground was intense. Sarah's water was now critically low, and she began to experience the early symptoms of dehydration, headache, dizziness, and increasingly dark urine. That evening, Sarah found shelter near the road and faced a terrible decision. Her water would not last another day, and she had seen no signs that the road led anywhere promising. She had to find water soon, or she would not survive much longer. She remembered reading about desert plants that stored water, but she was afraid of consuming something toxic. She also recalled that morning dew could sometimes be collected in desert environments, though she had seen no evidence of dew during her time in the Mojave. As night fell on her third day alone, Sarah experienced her darkest moments. The reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was dying of thirst in one of the most remote places in North America, with no realistic hope of rescue. She had not told anyone her exact destination, and even if someone reported her missing, searchers would have no idea where to look. Sarah allowed herself to grieve for a few minutes, crying tears she could not afford to lose. Then, she forced herself to focus on survival. She was not dead yet, and as long as she remained alive, there was hope. She needed to think creatively and use every resource available to extend her survival time. That night, Sarah tried an experiment she had read about in survival guides. She removed her clothes and laid them on the rocks around her shelter, hoping to collect any moisture that might condense during the cooler nighttime hours. The desert air was extremely dry, but she was desperate enough to try anything that might provide even a few drops of water. To her surprise and relief, the technique actually worked. When she checked her clothes in the early morning, she found small amounts of moisture had condensed on the fabric. It was not much, perhaps equivalent to a few sips of water, but it was something. Sarah carefully wrung out her clothes and collected every precious drop in her empty water bottle. This small success gave Sarah renewed hope and energy. If she could collect a small amount of water each night, it might extend her survival time long enough to reach help. She decided to continue following the road while implementing every water conservation and collection technique she could remember. The fourth day brought new challenges and discoveries. As Sarah walked along the desert road, she noticed changes in the landscape that suggested she might be approaching a different type of terrain. The vegetation was slightly different, with new types of cacti and shrubs she had not seen before. More importantly, she spotted what appeared to be a man-made structure in the distance. The structure turned out to be an abandoned mining operation, a collection of rusted equipment, and a small wooden building that had been ravaged by years of desert weather. Sarah's heart sank when she realized the site was deserted, but she decided to investigate anyway. Sometimes abandoned sites contain useful supplies or equipment. Her search of the mining site proved to be a turning point in her survival story. Hidden beneath debris in the collapsed building, Sarah discovered an old metal container that still held a small amount of water. The water was stale and had a metallic taste, but it was uncontaminated and safe to drink. More importantly, she found several rusty tools and pieces of equipment that she could use to improve her chances of survival. Among the tools was an old shovel and some metal containers that could be used to collect and store water. Sarah also found remnants of a tarp that, while damaged, could still provide better shelter from the sun. These discoveries transformed her situation from hopeless to merely desperate, giving her the resources she needed to survive longer in the desert environment. Sarah spent that day reorganizing her supplies and improving her survival setup. She used the tarp to create a more effective shelter and arranged the metal containers to maximize water collection during the night. She also found some old canned food that was still edible, providing her with much-needed nutrition and energy. That evening, Sarah felt more hopeful than she had since Marcus disappeared. She had water, food, shelter, and tools. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could adapt and survive in this harsh environment. The abandoned mining site became her base camp, and she decided to spend several days there recovering her strength before continuing her journey towards civilization. As she settled down for her fourth night alone in the desert, Sarah reflected on how much she had learned about herself and her capabilities. The woman who had entered the desert as an adventure blogger seeking interesting content had been transformed into a true survivor, using ingenuity and determination to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. However, Sarah knew that her ordeal was far from over. The water she had found would not last forever, and she still needed to find her way to safety. The abandoned mining site was a temporary refuge, but it was not a permanent solution. Soon, she would need to continue her journey into the unknown, facing whatever new challenges the desert might present. What Sarah did not yet know was that her most difficult trials still lay ahead, and that her survival would depend on making choices that would test every limit of her physical and mental endurance. The story of her desert survival was entering its most critical phase, where life and death would be separated by the smallest of margins. Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to adventure, but she never imagined that her passion for exploring remote places would nearly cost her life. As an adventure blogger with over 200,000 followers, she had hiked through rainforests in Costa Rica, climbed mountains in Nepal, and explored caves in Mexico. Her Instagram account was filled with breathtaking photos and inspiring stories of courage and discovery. But nothing had prepared her for what would happen in the Mojave Desert. It was March 15th when Sarah received a message from Marcus Williams, a photographer she had met 6 months earlier during a hiking expedition in Colorado. Marcus was charming, experienced, and claimed to know the Mojave Desert like the back of his hand. He had grown up in Nevada and spent years photographing the desert's hidden beauty. His portfolio was impressive, filled with stunning images of rock formations, desert wildlife, and ancient Native American petroglyphs. Marcus proposed a collaboration that seemed perfect for Sarah's blog. He wanted to take her to a secret location in the Mojave Desert where few people had ever been. According to Marcus, there was a hidden canyon with a natural spring, surrounded by ancient rock art that told stories of tribes who had lived there thousands of years ago. The photos would be incredible, and the story would be unlike anything Sarah had ever written. Sarah was immediately interested. The Mojave Desert had always fascinated her, and the idea of discovering something truly unique appealed to her adventurous spirit. Marcus assured her that he knew the area perfectly and had made the journey many times before. He had all the necessary equipment, including GPS devices, emergency beacons, and plenty of water and food for a 3-day expedition. They planned to meet in Las Vegas on March 20th and drive together to the desert. Marcus would handle all the logistics, while Sarah would focus on documenting their journey and writing the story. It seemed like the perfect partnership between an experienced local guide and a talented storyteller. The morning of March 20th arrived with clear skies and perfect weather. Sarah flew from her home in Portland, Oregon, to Las Vegas, carrying her camera equipment, laptop, and enough clothes for a week-long trip. She was excited and had already started drafting ideas for her blog post. The title she had in mind was Hidden Treasures of the Mojave, Discovering America's Secret Canyon. Marcus picked her up at the airport in a white pickup truck loaded with camping gear. He seemed confident and well-prepared, which put Sarah at ease. They drove east from Las Vegas, heading toward the remote areas of the Mojave Desert. As they drove, Marcus told her stories about the desert's history, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography of the region. According to Marcus, their destination was about 4 hours from Las Vegas, in an area so remote that most GPS systems didn't have accurate maps. He claimed that only a few people knew about the location, and those who did were sworn to secrecy to protect the ancient rock art from vandalism. Sarah was impressed by his knowledge and his apparent respect for the desert's cultural significance. As they drove deeper into the desert, the landscape became increasingly desolate. The paved roads gave way to dirt tracks, and eventually, they were driving across open desert terrain. Sarah noticed that her cell phone had lost signal hours ago, but Marcus assured her that this was normal in such a remote area. He had satellite communication devices, he said, in case of emergency. They stopped several times along the way for Marcus to check his GPS and take photographs. Each time, he seemed confident about their direction and progress. Sarah took advantage of these stops to capture images of the dramatic desert landscape, with its towering rock formations, sparse vegetation, and endless expanse of sand and stone. As the sun began to set on their first day, Marcus found a suitable place to set up camp. They were surrounded by red rock formations that glowed brilliantly in the fading light. Sarah was amazed by the beauty of the desert at sunset and spent the evening taking photographs and writing notes for her blog. Marcus proved to be excellent company around the campfire. He cooked a delicious meal using a portable camping stove and shared more stories about the desert's wildlife and history. He seemed knowledgeable about desert survival techniques and pointed out various plants that could provide water or nutrition in emergency situations. Sarah felt fortunate to have such an experienced guide. That night, sleeping under the star-filled desert sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace and excitement. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. She had never seen so many stars, and the experience felt almost spiritual. She went to sleep looking forward to reaching their destination the next day. The second day began early, with Marcus eager to cover more ground before the desert heat became too intense. They packed up their camp and continued deeper into the Mojave. The terrain became more challenging, with rocky outcrops and deep ravines that forced them to take detours and navigate carefully. As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice changes in Marcus's behavior. He seemed less certain about their direction and spent more time checking his GPS devices. When Sarah asked about their progress, Marcus assured her that they were on the right track, but she could sense tension in his voice. Around midday, they reached a particularly challenging section of terrain where the truck could go no further. Marcus announced that they would need to continue on foot from this point. According to him, the hidden canyon was only a few miles ahead, accessible by a narrow trail that wound through the rock formations. They loaded their backpacks with water, food, and camera equipment, leaving the heavier camping gear in the truck. Marcus carried a large pack with what he claimed were emergency supplies and navigation equipment. Sarah's pack contained her cameras, laptop, and personal items, along with 2 water bottles that Marcus had given her. The hike began in the early afternoon, with the desert sun beating down mercilessly. The temperature was well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating from the rocky ground through her hiking boots. Marcus set a steady pace, frequently checking his compass and GPS device. As they walked, Marcus pointed out various features of the landscape and continued to share his knowledge about the desert's ecology. He showed Sarah different types of cacti and explained how desert animals had adapted to survive in such harsh conditions. Despite the heat and difficulty of the hike, Sarah remained enthusiastic about their adventure. After hiking for about 2 hours, they reached a high ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding desert. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, with no signs of human habitation visible anywhere. Sarah was struck by the vastness and isolation of their surroundings, but she trusted Marcus's expertise and experience. Marcus suggested they take a break to rest and hydrate before continuing. As they sat in the shade of a large boulder, Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed increasingly agitated. He kept checking his devices and muttering under his breath. When she asked if everything was all right, he snapped at her irritably, saying that the GPS was having technical difficulties but that he knew where they were going. This was the first sign that something might be wrong, but Sarah chose to trust Marcus's experience and expertise. After all, he had assured her many times that he knew this area well and had made this journey before. She assumed that GPS problems were common in such remote areas and that an experienced desert guide would be able to navigate by traditional methods if necessary. They resumed hiking in the mid-afternoon, with the sun still high and the temperature continuing to climb. The terrain became more difficult, with loose rocks and steep inclines that made walking treacherous. Sarah began to feel the effects of the heat and exertion, but she pushed forward, motivated by the promise of discovering something truly extraordinary. As evening approached, Marcus announced that they would need to camp for the night and continue to their destination the next morning. According to him, they were very close to the hidden canyon, but it would be dangerous to attempt the final approach in the dark. Sarah was disappointed, but understood the wisdom of his decision. They found a sheltered spot between 2 large rocks and set up a simple camp using lightweight equipment from their packs. Marcus prepared another meal, but Sarah noticed that he seemed distracted and kept looking around nervously. When she asked about his concerns, he claimed that he was just being cautious about wildlife, particularly rattlesnakes that were active in the area. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. The desert seemed different from the previous night, more threatening somehow. She could hear Marcus moving around restlessly, and several times she woke to find him standing outside their small tent, staring into the darkness. When morning came, she was relieved to see daylight and looked forward to reaching their destination. The third day would prove to be unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. As they prepared to break camp, Marcus made an announcement that would change everything. He claimed that he needed to return to the truck to retrieve some essential equipment that he had forgotten. According to him, the final approach to the hidden canyon required special climbing gear that was still in the vehicle. Marcus told Sarah to wait at their current location while he made the journey back to the truck. He estimated that it would take him about 4 hours to return with the equipment, and then they could complete their journey to the canyon. He left Sarah with specific instructions not to move from their camp and assured her that he would be back by early afternoon. Sarah watched as Marcus disappeared into the rocky landscape, his figure becoming smaller and smaller until he vanished completely. She was alone in one of the most remote and dangerous environments on Earth, but she still trusted that her guide would return as promised. She spent the morning taking photographs and writing in her journal, documenting their adventure and looking forward to the incredible discovery that awaited them. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The temperature soared, and Sarah sought shelter in the shade of the rocks. She rationed her water carefully, taking small sips and trying to stay cool. As the afternoon wore on, and Marcus failed to return, Sarah began to feel the first stirrings of concern. By sunset, it became clear that something was wrong. Marcus should have returned hours ago, and there was still no sign of him. Sarah tried to remain calm and rational, thinking of possible explanations for his delay. Perhaps he had gotten lost, or maybe the truck had broken down. She decided to wait through the night, confident that he would appear in the morning. But morning came, and Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Sarah was now alone in the Mojave Desert, with limited water, no means of communication, and no idea how to find her way back to civilization. The adventure she had been so excited about had suddenly become a fight for survival. She had no way of knowing that Marcus had never intended to return, and that she was now facing one of the most challenging ordeals any human being could endure. As the sun rose on what would be her first full day alone in the desert, Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her survival story would become one of the most remarkable tales of human endurance ever documented. The real adventure was just beginning, and it would test every limit of her physical and mental strength. Imagine waking up in the middle of nowhere, your throat burning like fire, your lips cracked and bleeding. The sun beats down mercilessly as you realize the terrible truth. Your water bottle is empty, your phone has no signal, and the person you trusted most has abandoned you in one of the world's most dangerous deserts. This isn't a movie. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old adventure blogger who thought she was embarking on the trip of a lifetime. Instead, she found herself fighting for survival in the Mojave Desert, where temperatures can reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and people die within hours without water. What happened next defied every survival expert's predictions. Sarah's story became a testament to human resilience that shocked rescue teams, amazed scientists, and inspired millions around the world. Her survival tactics were so unusual, so unexpected, that they're now taught in survival schools across the country. But this story isn't just about surviving the desert. It's about betrayal by someone she loved, discovering strength she never knew existed, and the miraculous series of events that turned certain death into an incredible tale of hope. You're about to discover how one woman's worst nightmare became humanity's most inspiring survival story. What Sarah did in those scorching desert days will challenge everything you think you know about the limits of human endurance. Her story starts with a lie, unfolds with unimaginable challenges, and ends with a discovery that scientists are still studying today.